taking orders on both sides when anyone wants to offer their preferred everyone can do so. So in affirmative, we have open to first we have Quran, second Daniel, third Zach. And negative UQ1, first Emily, second Chantel, third Sadie. Yeah, okay. Right, on the motion that given this simple slide, as this person, you would start a new religion. First birthday, yeah.
Thank you.
All forms of change attract resistance from dominant structures in society. But the way to change these dominant structures is to recognize that this certain degree of resistance is inevitable and to inspire people deeply enough to make sacrifices against that. And we tell you that the only way to do that in a particularly religious and conservative society is to adopt and co-opt religion as being part of enforcing liberalism. There are two key points that we'll be bringing to you today. Firstly, why adopting and creating a new religion is a better structure as opposed to activism that is either secular or reformist activism within religions. And secondly, why we think a more dogmatic religious approach to creating this liberal change is acceptable in the current context of the actor that we have today. Let's be clear in terms of what we stand for today. Firstly, we stand for this individual creating a single text that they claim that God inspired them to write, and creating a provision that God will never be able to speak to them again after that text has been created and written. Secondly, that this text becomes the foundation of that new religion. And it's important to note here that we know within this actor that they can learn from the mistakes of previous religions, right? So they're not going to write religious texts in the same way that Christianity might have, right? So they'll be much more clearer and concise and leave less room for radical misinterpretations of that text. We've learned from those mistakes. Within that text, what will you get? There are two key levels. Firstly, basic principles of fairness, of equality, of nonviolence that are general liberal principles. And then secondly, specific rules targeted at ending specific racist or misogynistic practices. So for example, specific rules banning FGM, not having a caste system and enshrining racial equality, right? And then lastly, that breaking those rules would be equivalent to attracting that divine punishment, right? Because it is still a religious structure. And it's also something that the Mormons have literally done, right? So the burden we need to prove in this debate today is that it's much better to advance liberalism in the particular context of that religious and patriarchal society by creating this new religion than general secular activism or reformist movements, which leads me neatly on to my first point. It's important to note here that this new religion will create a community bond around shared values and certain practices and purposes with strong intensity, right? It's stated in the motion that the individual has a strong confidence that they will be able to amass those followers, right? And we also assume that the opposition team wants to ban the very same illiberal practices like FGM, for instance, right? But why then is this approach better than the other two alternatives that they have to stand for? The first is that religion gives a fervor that intellectual or secular arguments can't. How does this happen? A few key reasons. The first is the creation of this new religion gives individuals the ability to drive towards a higher divine purpose that secular arguments can't. The second element also is that it stops infighting on specific issues, right? Because there's a greater sense of clarity from these new texts. There's a specific provision saying FGM is bad, that women are equal and autonomous beings to men, right? This clarity is something that intellectual arguments often don't necessarily have, because you have a broad range debate where you're trying to gain a plurality between individuals that inevitably leads to conflict, right? When you're in that adversarial format of trying to intellectually debate between people. That's why even leftist activists, right, can't agree on many core fundamental things in feminism, for instance. And thirdly, and really importantly, as this motion specifies, this individual lives in a conservative society. We can't apply a liberal and secular lens in terms of how individuals will react in this person's particular world, right? Because in the society that this individual is based in, that is incredibly patriarchal or conservative, you're probably going to have dominant religious forces that people naturally buy into, right? People are comfortable with the idea of divinity and finding moral purpose and guidance from a self-anointed individual or religious person who claims to have had that contact with God. There's a lesser degree of skepticalism in this world than what you might get coming from like a liberal bubble like Australia and New Zealand, and we need to be able to acknowledge that. So what that means then is that people within the society are more comfortable with the idea of subscribing to a literalist text that they have to abide their lives with, and being comfortable with this idea of divine punishment more so than in an illiberal world. The second aspect of this point is, why then is this a better than reformist approaches? Now, since I've talked to you about why the secular approach doesn't work, it's important to note here that reformists often rely on a broad and weak textual interpretation in order to create the liberal change that they seek to want. So it's this idea that because Jesus loves everyone, you can't be homophobic, right? Or you have to treat every immigrant with the same respect. Three issues with this world. The first is their approaches, because they're so broad, often conflict, right, with the orthodox literal text that they're purporting to reform, right? Because you can have someone who claims that modesty is not something a woman should follow in the Islamic religion, but if you literally have a hadith that is prescribing women to wear the hijab, there is an intense tension and clash, no matter how hard or broadly you try to interpret that statement. The second thing that happens is, from this, there's an insecurity in any reformist change, right? Because oftentimes secular reformists are overthrown by religious literalists. You've seen this in places like Pakistan and the Middle East, for instance, where reforms are often taken back and hijacked. And why is that the case? It's because it doesn't, thirdly, break down the underlying norms that still exist. Because even if you can claim that abortion is a right and a choice for women to have, it still doesn't change the underlying premise that women are not equal, autonomous beings. Therefore, we've proven to you why this approach is better than the two main approaches that OP has to stand for. Thirdly, why this dogmatic religious approach is acceptable in the current context that we live in. It's important to note here that at worst, what we end up getting is a better society, even though the religion we might not be ideal, right? For example, we might have a specific rule that bans FGM, and we think it's okay to have non-flexible rules and have dogmatic punishments in this particular context. Why is that the case? So why then in our fixed rules good? We think that they generate change instead of being merely reflective of what society wants. Flexible rules leads to bad interpretations because people have to depend on their morality, which is ultimately shaped by the patriarchal forces OP wants to change, which ultimately means that these rules are more likely, if they're not strict and dogmatic, to be susceptible to hijacking, right? To justify social hegemonies, like the norms for Islamic women and dress, right? Being used to aggressively restrict how women can express themselves in many circumstances. So at the end then, we tell you that a fixed rule is the best thing in the short term that we can have to implement change within the society. And that's why ultimately, this is the approach that is the best suited in the current context of living in a religious society where individuals are comfortable with the notion of subscribing to a divine revelation in order to create liberal change that both sides of the house want. Incredibly proud to affirm.
Thanks for that speech. How about the first negative speaker?
So loud. Like all the speakers have been so loud. Excellent.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, yeah. And the affirmative team told us that they wanted what was better in the short term. It was obvious that they hadn't thought about the long-standing ramifications of this debate, because this debate was about starting a religion and claiming that you had the final word of God crystallized in its most pure form, something that would affect the world and people across the world all over forever, in a way that meant that this was necessarily antithetical to progressivism, which was about including a diversity of voices, which was about challenging the dominant values in society, and was about progressing society into the future. And that's why they've lost this debate. We on side negative would prefer this activist, this individual, if they particularly if they did indeed have some capacity to influence their society, to engage in social and political activism, take advantage of that base, and engage in secular activism. So before I get into some stand-up today, I'm going to deal with briefly in rebuttal why they say this is a better mechanism. So the first thing they've told us is they're likely to have a huge community bond in this situation. Obviously, that's dependent on proving why they're going to have lots of followers. I'm going to tell you in great detail and substantive later why that's untrue. That was just totally asserted. Secondly, they told us that spirituality helps give people further, and that they've got that higher drive for a divine purpose. 3 reasons why this isn't true. So firstly, that means you specifically lose all capacity to be adapted later and to actually adapt any of this context later. But importantly, secondly, you require people to abandon their entire faith to embrace your philosophy and to embrace any of your message. And that to be compared in this debate, this is the difference between people who, obviously this is a conservative community, they've seem to think that sometimes conflates with religion. I admit there is also a significant overlap there. This means to embrace any of your progressive messages about women's rights, about, embracing pride, means that people necessarily need to abandon their religion and that they are antithetical in that instance. But thirdly, people who, people are quite likely to think this person is just a crazy person. Like anyone who just comes out now and says, I've been spoken to by God, doesn't necessarily mean people are going to embrace you. Like just because people are religious doesn't mean they love all other religions, see all religion-based conflict all over the world. Just having religion doesn't mean that you think that all spirituality is totally cool and zen. It means you're likely to think they're a crazy person and ignore them, and you just lose all your political capital there. Additionally, they told us it's bad to rely on a weak interpretation, as it often leads to conflict over the ideas here in the first instance. So firstly, progressivism is about a lack of clarity. Like people disagree in the progressive movement all the time about what's best for people, but also they use examples about women dressing modestly and things like that. A lot of women feel incredibly empowered by dressing modestly. If you wanted to have a really strict set of rules saying women cannot dress in a certain manner, I think that's also antithetical to progressivism, which is about empowering people and giving them choice. But secondly, I just think it's likely that they would be open to interpretation forever, and you lose the capacity to have control of that interpretation later anyway, particularly after you die. We'll discuss that later. 2 points in this speech. So firstly, why it's immoral to use religion as a tool for social change, and secondly, why this change is likely to be ineffective or bad. On to the first issue. So firstly, why don't we think progressives should never propagate religion? So firstly, religion is antithetical to progressive causes. So this is things like religion historically being responsible for a lot of things like women not being allowed to be priests, women not being allowed to drive. But secondly, structurally, there are 3 things that make it particularly antithetical to progressivism. Firstly, there's no diversity of voices included there because it's about that one voice from God. Secondly, there's always an in-group or out-group. There's the anointed people, the chosen people of God, and another group of people. But finally, there's no questioning allowed because this is the final word from the divine figure in your society. We think that is all antithetical to progressivism. But secondly, religion has historically also harmed a lot of people that progressivism particularly cares about. People like gay people like women, and other minority groups within society who are important to the progressive base. We think that it is immoral to abandon them in the pursuit of a religion, which is a structure that has oppressed them historically. Secondly, why do we think the mechanics of religion are inherently immoral in this instance? So further, we think it is morally wrong to take advantage of people by lying about a deity, and there are 3 main reasons that you take advantage of them. Firstly, you use metrics of fear. You say, if you do not do this, you will be condemned forever. Secondly, you use metrics of shame. So you tell them that you make them feel ashamed of their behavior and for not conforming to a certain thing. And finally, there's no contradiction of ideas. So you have to rely on them asserting this facts of the divine. I mean, that it's unfair to take advantage of people, particularly in the context context of the fact that religion often inflicts on people physical pain, particularly given the punishments that are often prescribed, but also emotional pain, and that cognitive dissonance and the cognitive pain that you experience by thinking that you can't conform to this idea of religion and being told that your way of living is inherently immoral. I think that this is particularly immoral in the context that you know that you haven't been spoken to by this deity and you are in fact lying to people. That is particularly manipulative and immoral in this debate, and we do not stand for that. Moving on to second point now about why this change is likely to be ineffective or bad. So the first question here to ask is, will this individual actually gain influence in the world? So there are three main reasons why we think they're unlikely to gain influence. So firstly, self-belief does not necessarily correlate with your ability to actually gain people, particularly someone who was perhaps delusional enough that they were about to go and start a religion that they have founded, perhaps doesn't have the best sense of reality in the first place. So they may not actually get anyone in there. They're likely to be seen as a cult. A lot of new religions that are started now, particularly those that aren't just unlike a social movement by comparison, where they have to claim just basic moral norms, as opposed to being like, my message is only legitimate because I've been spoken to by God. That's a significant buy-in that you have to have there, likely to be ineffective. Secondly, it's competing with many established religions, particularly in this conservative community, that have been proven by history. This is things like competing with things that people really value, and you're also competing for a group of people who really value that spirituality, who are likely to have already found a faith that they conform to and that is in opposition to your faith. But B, like there are many progressive churches and institutions such as that are already being established in society that can meet that thing. For instance, churches that perform same-sex weddings and things like that. So likely you are competing for people who either have already found a faith and are already progressive within that context, or are unlikely to subscribe to that anyway because they don't find it persuasive if you're in a particularly conservative community already. But finally, society is while we understand that this debate takes place in a society that is genuinely conservative, there is a trend towards secularism in society. So we think that over time, you're less likely to have people joining churches and more likely to join social movements overall. So that's why we think that you're not likely to have lots of people and lots of influence in this debate in the first instance. But what if you did get lots of people? Why it wouldn't work anyway? So firstly, we think that you don't have the capacity to affect change in society unless you become the dominant religion in this society and you become basically across the, above the law. This is a lengthy process of, basically usurping all other religions in society. Contrast that speaker with, just becoming a social movement and being able to legislate for change within their lifetime, because all you need to convince people on is like one or two key ideas that are good bills and good laws that you can vote on, as opposed to convincing people that their entire way of seeing the world, the way their grandparents saw the world, is incorrect and that they are idiots and that you are the only one with the truth and the light. That is a much more significant thing. But importantly, even if you are just 30% of the population, that's not enough. You need to be the dominant driving force within that society. That's pretty difficult. Secondly, you have to exist in opposition to all of those other churches, because people can't just buy into your individual policies or your individual ideas. They have to, as I said earlier, abandon their entire type of spirituality that they built their entire life around. You necessarily position yourself in opposition to the most dominant forces in society. You're positioning yourself in opposition to lobbying powers like the Catholic Church and like whatever religious forces exist in this hypothetical society. Thirdly, you alienate your base. You're tainted by that religiosity. So the progressives in your community who have been failed by religion feel like your policies are now tainted forever because you're endorsing, a mechanism that has oppressed people, as I discussed earlier. And fourthly, we think the state just might also be secular, even though it's a conservative community. So if there's not a strong correlation between that religion and that, policy drive, we think that you achieving this through a religious mechanism does not actually necessarily influence policy in that society. Comparing with activism, where you can achieve equality and you don't have to be established and taken as seriously, we think that you can achieve much quicker. Even if it does work, we think firstly you are locked into that dogma forever, which is inherently antithetical to progressivism. Secondly, it's your idea of progressivism is not necessarily the correct form of progressivism and not necessarily good for the world. And finally, we think that progressivism is about diversity of thought, and we shouldn't lock people into that forever, and that's why we're very proud to oppose.
Okay, thanks for that speech. I invite the second affirmative speakers.
In some ways, the opposition is right. There are dangers to creating religions because they might instruct people how to dress, they might become exclusive, and they might become violent. But importantly, what was mainly lacking from the opposition was an explanation of why the comparative in this debate isn't the already existing religion that is likely to be far worse. And importantly, they missed two things that we did in our first speech, which explained how we mitigate an enormous amount of the harms that we were talking about. Firstly, we have control over how we set up religions. It is true that women's religions can instruct women how to dress. It is not true that we are going to instruct women how to dress. You are the final word of God, which means you don't have to instruct people to discriminate against other religions. In fact, you can make it one of the central tenets of your religion that you tolerate other people's religions. And secondly, you as an individual live within a society in which you are intimately familiar with the failings of religions. Not only can you learn from the failings of religions on an intellectual perspective, but you know what it feels like to have a religion instruct you how to act. And importantly, that is deeply, deeply important for how you then set up that religion. I'll be explaining this debate through two lenses. Firstly, in explaining why religion being bad does not mean that our religion is going to be bad. And then secondly, talking about why religion generates and structures change rather than merely reflecting existing desire that they would want to capitalize on their side of the house. But before that, I have one thing to note about the foundations of this debate, and that is about the relationship of this motion to time. Because the first thing I want to analyze here is the assumption from the opposition that we will or will not be successful. And the thing I want to note here is it actually kind of doesn't matter whether we are or aren't successful in creating a religion. Because on one side, you don't create a religion, there's almost literally no harm. On the other side, you do create a religion in which you do have social benefit. On their side of the house, the major harm that they can point to is someone feeling awkward that their religion didn't take off. And on our side, we take the chance of massively changing society. So even if they can prove it's unlikely, and in fact, I kind of want to blame the context slide for that. It was deeply unclear what we can actually assume in this debate about being successful or not successful. But even if it's a small religion, this is all just symmetrical, right? For that small group of people, we can help meaningfully change their life. But secondly, this religion exists into the future. And importantly, what that means is that if we look at other religions that were started by founders who claim to be the word of God, you are likely to get evolution in the way that religion works. Importantly, the fact that the founder was a religious literalist becomes less important the longer time goes on. See, for example, Mormonism. What does that mean? When they wanted to talk about future dogmatism, it kind of fell out of the debate. Because what are the types of values we're telling people to instruct? The general values are already going to be kind of flexible, right? You want bodily autonomy, you want nonviolence, it's up to you, but it gives people a solid moral foundation on which to make those difficult contextual choices. And then let's look at the specific things that we were going to ban. Because I want to note the opposition didn't say a single thing about banning FGM, which was the key example used on our side of the house, and how you can just tell a religious community that this central part of what used to be a religion can be done differently. I want them to stand up and say why they're comfortable not using an existing mechanism in a dogmatic way to literally stop some of the worst harms that religious communities do to the people that work on them. At the end of this debate, if you look at the way time impacts the religion that we've created, the general values that we put into people will tend to be better than the general morality of the society that they're going to be existing on. And when we can solve specific problems like FGM, we definitely should be acting in dogmatic ways, and we are the ones who can shape that religion. Which brings me to the first point of clash, and that is just the idea that they pointed to a huge amount of historical examples as to why religion instructed you to do bad things, and we just had a very clear case coming from Ath that we wouldn't instruct those people to do those bad things. So that means all of their material about why religions historically are bad is exactly what I would want to show the person founding this religion and teach them how not to set up their religion. I want to hear an actual defense of why these religions are inherently anti-liberal, because there are many religions that are currently liberal, like a lot of Unitarians living in the United States who have managed to find ways to create religious norms and religious foundations that are deeply, deeply compatible with the liberal order. And importantly, what I want them to be able to defend is the fact that they wanted to say that people care really deeply as being the thing that makes things different. That was exactly the mechanism we had on our side of the house when we told you why religions inspire more amount of sacrifice, more amount of being able to really get to grips with the fact that there are problems with society and then be able to do things that are effective. And importantly, we can tell people to do these things in ways that aren't proselytizing, that aren't aggressive, but merely make an impassioned and specific point, and that religious people will be likely to make that message with a significant more amount of discipline than any other group. Look, for example, the anti-abortion movement in the United States. This is a very clear example of the type of rule that we wouldn't include within our religion, and in fact might be one of the specific rules that we say we probably should make abortion and bodily autonomy one of the fundamental rights of women. The anti-abortion movement in the United States has been able to maintain an incredibly specific and incredibly effective message as to why abortion is bad. And they've been able to do so while controlling a huge amount of people who have lots of disparate interests relating to other things. This is exactly why you need religion as one of the foundational structures for when you try and create these types of change. Because it's not the liberal examples that have been successful that are our examples in this debate. It is the illiberal examples that are successful, and you can merely change the focus to be far more effective. And importantly, once again, no addressing the fact that the comparative in this debate is likely to be the continued existence of this awful religion, explicitly when they wanted to note how ineffective you are as an individual to create any meaningful change for those people. Second question. Why does religion generate and structure change in important ways? And importantly, religion inspires people to make changes, and any type of moral argument that you make is likely to some degree to be coercive. I want you to ask why a secular person making arguments that we should respect women also wouldn't use norms of shame, also wouldn't use norms of moral coercion, because that's what it means to exist within a moral community in which you make arguments to each other about the way that they should behave. They want to depend a lot of their analysis on the idea that it's manipulative to lie to people. I just actually don't care whether we are lying to these people, because the comparative is you allow awful cultural practices to continue to exist, and remember, the other religion is also lying to people. So to the degree that you can free them from someone who's also lying to them, that is a good thing. A lot of the repression in this debate is likely to be symmetrical, because we are going to be bold in the way that we ask people to challenge social structures. Importantly, if they want to talk about backlash, they have to note that any of the type of changes that they also want to seek are going to inspire backlash. How do you inspire people to make the sacrifices necessary to stand up to your community leaders, to stand up to people to care about, to stand up to your family about their problematic beliefs? It is only through the belief in something that is truly bigger than you, a purpose that you have in life that allows you to access that deep well of humanity that we think exists in each people. At the end of this debate, it's important to note that liberal causes will not be tainted by the fact that a religion also occupies some of those norms. In many ways, religion and non-religion can coexist. And specifically, the way in which we are going to set up this religion is one that prioritizes avoiding all of the problems that they want to make on their side of the house. If you're looking for a way to judge this debate, ask yourself if the attacks that they have brought are truly inherent to religion, or are they things that can be created and can be learned from when we're looking at how we make decisions into the future. But at the end of the debate, it's very clear. I don't know why we don't make religious arguments to people about why FGM is wrong.
Thanks for that speech. I invite the second negative speaker.
Panel, the end is absolutely not always worth the means. This affirmative team should not support the practices of pro-life activists simply because it is kind of successful in shaming people out of the decisions of their own bodies, because that's what they ignore the facts are when it comes to religious doctrines. It tells people that there is only one way to act or one way to believe, and in everything that they do, in every way that they think and operate and choose to do things with their own bodies, that they should consider first and foremost the role of that text, the role of that deity in the way that they construct their lives. This church, the thing that this individual should support if they are they're progressive and they believe in progressive ideals and want progressive outcomes, is not one that avoids discussion. It's not a church that shames the vulnerable and operates by referring people to the text rather than engaging in discussions that tells them why FGM is wrong and why we need to change these practices in order to protect people. It is unclear to me why that is not more effective than simply telling people FGM is wrong because this text says so. In order to actually achieve behavioural change that affects people's lives, you need to engage with them with more than simply because God says so. That is not something we should support in this debate. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. First, I'm going to deconstruct this model and prove why even, like, they can try and say, like, we won't be bad, we promise. It will still be bad and it can still operate in ways that are particularly pernicious. Second, I'm going to explain their burden and explain why they need to prove that this religion will be successful, because if it is not successful and it is tied to progressivism, it will absolutely halt progressivism in this society for the foreseeable future when progressivism is tied to a failing religion that shames people as their mode of progressive activism. And finally, I'm going to engage in this principle and why it should still matter independently of these practical questions in this debate. So, what was the model we get from Team Affirmative? Obviously, it's a single text. They say it is clear and concise to avoid misinterpretation. The problem with religious texts is not that they are not clear or not concise. The problem is that the principles are extended. They take one rule and put that up to a general principle that is then applied in different situations where it was not supposed to be, into new situations as things change. Or secondly, that they are misapplied. And I think a good example of that is when they say this text will prevent racial inequality. But sometimes you need to consider questions like what is inequality and what is inequity? And should we do things like procedural or substantive fairness in the way that, for example, affirmative action campaigns can be seen to be racist in different ways, but actually positive discrimination that enable people to make more choices? That is the kind of nuance that any language must ignore, that any sort of script will not be able to deal with into the future and will prescribe one thing forever, which is most likely to be misapplied. But also consider the actor in this debate panel. In a deeply conservative patriarchal society where people are reading this text, they are most likely to misapply these rules. They are most likely to read into them in pernicious ways and excuse their own behaviours, to ignore the kind of cognitive dissonance that we tell you exists in this debate. Those are the people who are most likely to apply to this. So they say, no, we can't avoid this. Trust me, it just won't be bad. So obviously they cannot use like lofty principles in order to get this text like, I believe in equality, we should do good, because those things can be misinterpreted. See, every constitutional like dispute that ends up in the Supreme Court or High Court ever. But also you can't be particularly rigorous. And the reason why you can't be very, very specific is because those things can never be adapted into future situations. If you want this religion to actually like be comprehensive in the sense that it creates like holistic progressive change, then it can't be 3 rules that you agree on, because people can't opt into that. That is just a law, in which case you should probably just enact 3 different laws rather than trying to sell yourself out as a religion. The only way, therefore, you can have this broad liberal church that they want to celebrate is by having a broad church, which is not possible when you have a religion that has one text and there's only one interpretation, and you deny all other interpretations, as exhibited by this actor who has said in the info slide they refuse to have any further like follow-ups from God about what God envisages that text to mean. And I think that their own substantive highlights this at different times when they talk about the struggles with reforming the church from the inside, because it is very difficult and that text is difficult to negotiate with, and sometimes it can conflict and something like that. That is precisely the reason they identify as to why reform of that church will never occur. So that's why it is most important that we do this right first time, which they are unable to do. So the next thing that they say is that, well, we actually don't have to prove that this church will get up, because worst comes to worst, we just like, make a bit of an error and, oh, that's too bad. Firstly, if you want to create any actual change, you obviously need to have a successful church. And the reason isn't even if. Either you need to overcome legislative change. That's to say you need to legalize abortion, you need to legalize freedom of movement for women and things like that, in which case you absolutely need a broad following in order to get that legislative change. But also, specifically, you probably need behavioural change on the board. So you need a lot of people to be agreeing with you in order to convince other people to act in particular ways and not do particular practices. So that means you need to do that in order to get change. But, so they say like, oh, well, nothing happens, we'll just go home, that's too bad. These are the specific harms of that church not going well. Firstly, you hurt progressivism, because in this world, progressivism is not popular. There are not many progressive actors in this conservative patriarchal world. So at the point at which you say, I'm the only progressive person that I know, and this is my church and this is my belief, and then it crashes and burns because everyone thinks that you are not very sensible, that is why progressivism will struggle to get up into the future and struggle to get popularity. Secondly, you say progressivism looks like this. It looks like it is is coming from a god or a church, and so you necessarily tie progressivism to religion in ways that are unpalatable to other people who have been particularly affected by those religions, who are often, unfortunately, progressives in the way that progressivism is targeted in religions. But thirdly, we think independently and principally, it is harmful and wrong to manipulate vulnerable people and to tell them that God said that they should operate in these particular ways. And we think that that harm exists independently of the practical material, but nonetheless, it stands. So what were the outcomes, and why did we tell you that it would not get up? Firstly, we said in a conservative and patriarchal world, it is unclear to me why that counter-religion either would not pop up or just would not win, right? Like in the worlds where there are competing marketplaces of ideas and one is already dominant, it's quite difficult to overcome that initial inertia in order to create change. Secondly, in a marketplace of religions, you need to convince people to convert, not necessarily kind of opt in, but fully convert themselves into that religion. And that was important. That can be directly contrasted with social movements and activism, because when you only require people to vote in a certain way, it is much easier to opt in rather than convince their entire lives, their entire beliefs that this is something different and I believe that now. So that means we can get change faster under our side of the house. But and that is also a second reason then. So one, it's easy to opt in, but secondly, it is faster because instead of having a critical mass to overcome the state, you only need a critical mass in that particular election or on that particular bill. That is far easier to achieve within your lifetime, which means you get more positive change sooner. But thirdly, it's more a collaborative process, which is beneficial over that of a church. So you're able to interface with bad actors and explain to them why their particular practices hurt people and why they are incorrect and wrong. And that means you're able to get more systemic change and more sustainable change. But fourthly and finally, we think activism and social movements are more accessible than religions because you do not have to, some people are excluded from different religious practices because of the language of that text, because it uses shame as a mechanism as well. So therefore, it's much easier to start outside of the system rather than pretend to opt into religion in order to achieve the political ends that you want. And there are a number of other reasons we pointed to as well about why that religion won't get up. For example, it alienates people who are hurt. You have to confront the state in order to be successful. You are often to be looked upon as someone who is not very sensible or a little bit illogical in the way that you try and capture people. Finally, on this speech, in terms of the principle, they wanted to say that this wasn't very important as long as we achieved our aims, but we fundamentally dispute that. We think that this is independent of that practical clash, and that is that mechanisms that religions rely upon should never be supported by progressive actors. It is wrong to target vulnerable people and manipulate them and remove their freedom of choice in the way that they act, in the way that they think, for your political aims. It is wrong to tell someone that God has told me that the way you are acting is wrong and you must act in this way in order to go to heaven. Otherwise, you will burn in hell for the next set of hundreds of years. That is an independent harm that we should never support as a progressive, not only because it hurts people cognitively and physically, but because you do not enable that marketplace of ideas, you remove people's freedoms of choice, and you do not enable any sort of change. Progressivism should always be opposed to that. Proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech. I invite these scholars to take the question.
Good. The big question at the end of the second negative speaker's speech, and the question the third negative speaker is going to have to answer quite late, is one of conversion. Do you think that it is more likely you're going to convert people to another form of faith and speak to the language they understand in a conservative society where your laws, morality, and purpose and meaning is constructed by a higher authority, or tell them that their faith does not exist, that textual interpretations were made thousands of years ago, and that you have to deny your faith for progress? Because that is fundamentally the approach that secular activists have to take in this debate. At no point have they responded to the substantive material from Quran in his first speech about why it is reformist movements are unlikely to succeed, and even when they do, that the reform is glacial or prone to failure in the future. Let's face it, no system of morality that does not give you meaning and purpose in your life, particularly in this conservative society, more so than our real world, is ever going to succeed. Because telling people they're autonomous in the void is depressing. It's dark. It means you literally have no purpose and you have to claw through arbitrary moral maxims that you impose upon yourself and find no satisfaction. religion is a powerful force, and it's time that it is geared towards something good instead of remaining a dominant narrative that destroys people's lives under the world we live in. 2 questions. First, is religion fundamentally immoral? There seems to be a contention from the negative team, and we'll explain why it isn't. And then secondly, how do we best effectively change the social rules which govern our moral communities? First then, is religion immoral? They had 3 claims as to why religion was antithetical to progressivism. But as a foundational point, we don't necessarily have to stand behind any traditional ambit of progressivism. We just think that a society that is far more inclusive and one that does not punish people for characteristics that they do not live by, even if there's less diversity of discussion and thought, is still preferable to any one in which you remain with the status quo. But what was their claim? First, there is no diversity of discussion. I think they misunderstood our fiat in this debate to construct a particular religion in the way in which it operates, and that we can offer a specific guidelines that you ought to respect the equality of persons and not be prescriptive in what that looks like, because we don't have to follow the religions of the past. And to the extent that second negative was concerned about equality and equity and how that might be apportioned, that's the kind of discussion you can have. But the starting point now is that equality must be respected, as opposed to questioning equality whatsoever, because the conservative religious texts of the past do not enshrine that. The second claim was that there is an in-group and an out-group, and that religion is fundamentally exclusionary. Our religion does not have to say that you should treat those of other faiths poorly, and many religions to this day do say that you should treat your others with kindness, even to the extent they do not agree with your faith. We cannot stop people hating each other, and there are factors beyond religion that drive communities apart, be it ethnic nationalism and whatever. What we can do is preach a merit message that even though you do not share your faith, you ought to treat these people with compassion. Lastly, they said that there was no questioning of this religion, and that was bad. We think that our religion has the capacity to be flexible and evolve as many faiths had. In 1980, the Mormon Church, the head of the Mormon Church, had a divine revelation from God that black people weren't immoral anymore, right? That seems pretty effective given there are now black people in the Mormon Church. Like, you can watch a 2014 Australs final where this point was used as well if you're dubious. It does truly exist. But the point is that religion does have the capacity to evolve to some extent when you do, like, basically sit it in place and it isn't fixed in time. But there are sometimes foundational things that you can't get past about the role of certain persons, their ability to operate inside a moral community. If you set a starting point where their basic human decency is ensured, you can have all those discussions. Next, it's deceitful. I want to be as glib as my second speaker, but I'm actually going to engage as to why, like, lying might potentially be bad. But I think the general case here is that lying is fundamentally fine to some extent. That if you are going to potentially had, you know, like Nazis at your door and they were going to knock on the door, it's like, do you have any Jews in your radar? We would say, you probably should say no in that case because you should prioritize the lives and well-being of these people. Because ultimately, any respect of autonomy must be weighed against the autonomy of multiple people. It's fundamentally a consequentialist question. You can say, don't lie and respect that one person's autonomy, but then those 5 people die. To the same extent that you want to say you're breaching people's autonomy, that must be weighed up against the fact that you're allowing a moral community to continue to exist that denies people's basic human decency. What did they then say? They did want to say you should prioritize autonomy. Note this takes place in a particularly conservative society, as I already alluded to, so it's unclear as to why these people would ever respect arguments from autonomy, given they care more about fixed moral mores than they do any kind of autonomous arguments. But secondly, we do not think these arguments won't work, and even our society today is an example of this. They lied about a secular trend. That simply does not exist. Religion, in particular, Islam, is one of the fastest growing religions in the world. If anything, it's because the projects of liberalism in the 1990s and the expansion of capitalism have failed. It turns out money and a lot of choice doesn't give you any meaning, hope, or purpose, which is why people still look to religion to say, how can I live my life? How can I be a good person? And without using that fundamental basis on which you share those kind of arguments, it's never going to be effective. Which brings me on to the second point then, how do you effectively change social roles? Let's look at the comparative here, because I don't think it is our burden to prove that this religion is going to be successful, because they have to stand behind a status quo where nothing happens or that change and reform is unlikely to be static, at which point it can be reasserted because those underlying conservative norms still exist. What was their claim though? They were like, we're going to get secular reform and push for policies 1 or 2 a year that are going to be effective. I think the problem here is that let's look, for example, the United States, where in 1975, Roe v. Wade determined that abortion was a woman's choice. that debate and discussion still takes place to this day, and people die over that when they're bombed outside abortion clinics. And the reason for that is because they do not speak the same narrative fundamentally. There's no way to reconcile choice and life because they're fundamentally different conceptions. But when you have a religion that says, life doesn't begin in the womb, but it begins at birth, you can get past that stopgap. But just bleating on about choice consistently never deals with the fact that these are lived experiences of people of religion and authority, and that to go against that is to deny their very existence. And remember, this takes place in a very conservative society where they are likely to be incredibly religious. There was a dubious claim from First Negative that they could be conservative but not religious, but it seems very unclear because oftentimes being conservative is about taking meaning from fixed rules and saying that that's where your meaning and purpose comes from, which is why conservative societies naturally map on to religious patterns of organization. At which point then, we would say that you can be liberal in this conservative society because you give them fixed rules, meaning and purpose as a way in which you should live your life and treat others. What do they want to say? This church is going to be bad because it's going to be tied to progressivism. Firstly, it's actually just kind of unclear what the tension is here, because they want to say that this church would be like a loony thing that'd be really small and started. So if this religion isn't going to be successful, it's unclear as to how a really small fringe religion is going to harm progressivism writ large if there's literally no impact whatsoever. But secondly, just as another note on this as well, let's just say that there was a massive church that argued for they were really crazy. They had some very religious ideas, but they also supported free libraries. That probably wouldn't harm the underlying arguments for free libraries, right? Because there are still arguments those secular people would use to try and advance their views. Even though they're not effective, that would still mean that those arguments exist independent, whether or not a bad group aligns with that. But thirdly, we think this will work to some extent. There are many victims of FGM and many people that find themselves dissatisfied with the world, but want someone that speaks to them with the language of divinity and not deny the fact that there is no higher power out there. At the end of the day, people aren't liberal. They don't like autonomy. It's a sad world when you have no purpose. We're the only side that changes the world because we don't strip them away of everything they hold dear.
Thanks for that speech. I invite the third negative speaker.
Speaker, in all the time the affirmative team spent throughout their case ridiculing our case, what they failed to do was to engage in what this debate had to trade off. That was that this person could spend their time and energy and capital and presumed followers starting a religion, or they could spend that time starting a social movement, political activism, political change. We gave you significant reasons why social capital would be better. And then when they told you that they didn't need to prove that the religion would be effective, they lost the debate because they failed to prove that they would actually gain anything. And we told you that that was a loss to your capacity to create social change that would be more effective. So that was a bit of a shame for them. 2 questions in this speech. Firstly, who gets better outcomes, and secondly, whether this is principally acceptable. Firstly, on who gets better outcomes. Why will religion be effective? The first thing that be ineffective. They tell you that religion is effective because people need a divine purpose to care about anything. It is deeply unclear to me why that is true, Speaker, on account of how there are plenty of people in society that are religious and are not religious and still do things and still feel like they have a purpose in life. And indeed, a similar purpose exists within social activism, because the purpose of achieving social change to help people that you think need to be helped, which makes you feel like you are a good person, does not require you to subscribe to a God that tells you that you're a good person, because you live in a society where there are moral ideals that say helping people is good. So this divine purpose was never proven to be necessary to motivate people to do things. Then they tell you that there are dominant religious forces in this conservative community, which is actually a reason why this church would be deeply ineffective, Speaker, because those dominant religious forces are indeed so dominant that people that were spiritual were likely to already subscribe to those conservative religious forces and would be deeply unlikely to change their mind and flip to this new newfangled, like fancy progressive religion that had very little following, but was also co-opting the narratives that they had believed for their whole life, that they had grown up with, that they had based their moral calculus on, and co-opting that for something that they had been taught their whole life not to believe in, to advocate for a cause that they thought was morally wrong, because that church, this new church, was co-opting their narrative of religion to advocate for abortion, something that they had been told their whole lives was fundamentally wrong. So you alienate those people so much that they are very, very unlikely to ever support your church. But you also have to compete with those established religions in a way that means that those established religions are likely to actively speak out against this new progressive religion, and that is likely to be well received in a conservative community. Why does that matter? That is because there is a trade-off of this person's time. And if this person has a strong belief that they would be able to amass support for their progressive religion, then presumably they believe that there is a significant number of people in their society that believe in progressive ideals to the extent that they would actually support this church, in which case they could probably convince those people to be a part of their social movement as well. But also there is an extra group of people in that society that do not believe in religion because they are queer or they have been sexually abused, and so they therefore do not subscribe to things that have anything to do with God. There would be an extra supporter base that person could get for their social capital movement. So social activism is A, much more effective and much more quickly effective, but B, allows this person to capture a much larger base. And the reason social activism, apart from all of the reasons Chantel gave you that they totally ignored, is actually better, is because it doesn't require people, like they try to assert, to deny their religion to believe in progressive causes, because it allows you to support individual issues, speaker. It allows you to say, to join in on a social movement about like banning FGM, right? And you're allowed to believe in banning FGM, but you don't have to betray your entire religion and subscribe to an entirely different text, an entirely different lifestyle than the one that you've grown up with and the one that you're comfortable with. Or you don't have to subscribe to religion at all if that's something that you're uncomfortable with. So many more people are likely to subscribe to social activism because it allows them to do things that they believe are right without having to change their entire lifestyle to prescribe to something that tells them how they should be living and what they should be doing. The next, also we think that this would alienate all like religious moderates that would probably vote on some of these socially progressive issues, and they think that a lot of religious moderates do exist because, as they tell us, not all churches are deeply, deeply conservative. There are some churches that do believe in things like gay marriage, or at least giving some rights to gay people, and I think you alienate those religious moderates when you claim to be like the fucking next prophet or whatever, and they have been taught that that is probably not true, and that person is not you, and they think that you are like basically ridiculing their religion to try and get outcomes that are beneficial for you. I think you alienate those people a lot. The next question to ask is why the comparative is not the continuing dominance of existing religions. The first reason for that is this church is not going to fucking take down Catholicism, speaker. Like, I think it was a bit disingenuous for them to be like, when we start our religion, the dominance of conservative religions ends forever. Obviously, that's not true, and they didn't prove why it was. But actually, this makes this worse because you bolster the influence of religion in society more generally. You bolster the influence of religions over the state and over the government where they're not really meant to be honest, and people don't generally think that the church influencing like policy is a good thing. So actually, you make those conservative religions much more powerful by adding to the religious influence that exists in society and adding to the lobbying power and the importance that is given to the opinions of religion when you make policy. What's the next thing to ask? So basically, it's going to be inefficient. Social activism would be a lot better, and they make the influence of conservative religions a lot worse. Why then will this lead to bad outcomes if it is effective? They tell you that they have loose principles, and then they tell you that they have strict rules, which was interesting. But anyway, they were like, our loose principles, we have strict rules because we don't want things to be open to interpretation, but we also have loose principles so that you can't tell us that we will say that things will happen and then those things will change in the future. They unfortunately cannot have both of those things, speaker. Their loose principles will be open to interpretation, but also loose principles are like relatively meaningless. Like, I don't know if you guys have heard about what like the 7 deadly sins are or whatever, or like the 10 commandments. Most of them are pretty vague and generally things that we would all agree with. I
don't think that that means that people think Christianity is particularly great. Like thou shalt not murder is like pretty all right, but it's not really led to like the best outcomes. Yeah, people don't always subscribe to it. But also, progressivism, speaker, and liberalism means change, and that means that their strict rules that they have now will be problematic in the long term, because what we believed 10 years ago and what the progressive movement believed 10 years ago is not what we believe now. 10 years ago, we might have said that only women are allowed to vote on issues that affect women. But now we would say that trans women are also able to have opinions on those ideas. 10 years ago, people wouldn't have been so open, they wouldn't have even known what to do about transgender identity, speaker. There are things that will happen in the future. There are things that will evolve that we need to be able to accommodate. And these strict rules might end up harming those people in the same way that all strict rules from all religions ever have failed to adapt with change. And by having strict rules, you are necessarily being inherently conservative in your religion, because you are setting at a certain point in time rules that people will have to live by forever, and that is inherently antithetical to progressivism, because that is not what the word progressivism means, speaker. And there was no discussion. They could not say, well, our church would always do good things, because we would have a discussion about it, because this was the final word. So once you wrote that text, you could not update it. That discussion could not happen. That was a lie. First, the next reason that this is bad is that you alienate anti-religious progressives. And that is important because it splits the progressive movement between those that exist in this religious progressivism and those that exist in social activism, which means that those two groups are working against each other, which makes conservatives more powerful. That matters more, speaker, because change takes time. So what happens in the long term is more important than the short term. Speaker, this religion would be disastrous. It would hurt people and it would stop social activism, and we are so proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech, and invite the negative reply speaker.
When the affirmative team hung their hat in this debate on getting the word of God correct at the right time, despite the fact they said that they could have conversations about the interpretation, they failed to acknowledge the fact that this was the final word of God that would affect society forever, and that it was inherently antithetical to progressivism to set in stone the rules by which we live our lives, because it failed to acknowledge the plethora of ways in which society could change, morality could change, and the circumstances could change. And that's why they lost this debate. Two issues in the speech. Firstly, on whether the religion will be good, and secondly, on whether it will be effective. So on to the first issue now about whether this religion will be a positive force in society if it was effective. So the first thing they told us was that they've learned from all other religions and all failings that have ever occurred forever, and that it's going to be good. And they told us that this would mean that it would likely consist of loose principles. However, as we've told you down the bench today, it's unclear how, they had a shifting characterization at all points throughout this debate. And it was unclear how these loose principles about, basic moral ideas were going to be able to inspire the kind of religious fervor that, all these other religions leaned into, and why they would actually, telling people that they should be nice to other people. They failed to at any point back any kind of origin story or any kind of firm moral basis or any kind of arguments that would actually be enough to inspire people. So they either had to have these loose principles that, as we've told you down the bench, were likely to be ineffective, open to interpretation, and not very inspiring, or they needed to back a more specific set of rules. And they tried to do both at once, but ultimately it seemed like this wasn't going to be a particularly effective set of rules or necessarily a particularly positive force within society. They failed to engage in all the reasons we told you why this religion was going to be structurally bad. Things like the idea that progressivism means change, and that having a very, very rigid structure that was not open for debate because it was the final word of God, that was likely to shut people out, and based on the fact that there was an in-group and an out-group in that society. Even though they did try to say that you could just instruct people to be kind to all of religions, as we've told you down the bench today, this it necessarily had to be some opposition to some ideas. You couldn't embrace everyone who loved FGM if you were going to have your tenant be that was a negative thing to have. So obviously there was going to need to be some kind of difference there. But yeah, so they failed to engage in any of the reasons why we told you that this was structurally bad, and that And also in the ways in which society can change. The idea that beliefs around equity and equality are different and that being over-prescriptive shuts people out. The idea that people didn't have a working understanding of, many trans issues, of issues such as like cultural appropriation that we've explained to you down the bench today. And that people's ideas around progressivism are not uniform under the status quo and will continue to shift into the future. And why religion and the structures that do not encourage questioning and encourage a dogmatic view of the world don't actually facilitate that. They also failed to engage in any of our analysis about why people who have been structurally shut out of religions and feel betrayed by this kind of, an unquestioning of authority. People who have been subject to like sexual abuse, people who have been feel like shut out due to like persecution of religious and like sexual minorities, why those people don't want to buy into it and why the progressive movement should care about those people. And that's why I think this religion will not be good. Secondly, will it even be effective? So they told us that religious people will join this religion as it appeals to a purpose. Firstly, we've obviously told you today that you need to displace their entire worldview, and it's a total buy-in or opt-out kind of system. People who like religions don't like all religions. A lot of people who like religions hate every single other religion because they think it undermines everything they tell them about themselves. It was never explained to them why religious people would decide to opt into this. But importantly, if you in contrast with social activism, as we explained to you, you can't just opt in on a policy by policy basis. You need to entirely convert and change your entire life to buy into this religion versus social activism, which is much more effective. Additionally, it also increases your resistance because you become even more antithetical to change and you push back really hard because any social policy has to tie in, you have to change your entire religion to agree with it. And when you position those social policies as antithetical to people's religious beliefs under the status quo, you push back even harder. And none of this was even guarantee change under the status quo, because that's why we propped social activism, which could be incremental, could be legally binding, and you could have a greater supporter base and be achieved more quickly. Because we save the lives of people suffering under the status quo and plan for a more progressive future, we won this debate.
Thanks for that speech. The floor is mine.
This debate is not about whether people should believe in God, because this is a society in which people do believe in God. This is a society in where what we have done on our side of the house is to allow these people to retain their faith, their culturally constructed way of looking at meaning, and retain that faith while still being progressive, while still being liberal. Because importantly in this debate, two things are true. Religion isn't generally terrible, and I question them when they want to tell you that religious liberal people aren't welcome in our coalition because they're not allowed to apply for the norms of religion, but that equally, these people won't be uniquely receptive to us communicating to them with the language of religion. Because these religious people still want their religions, they just want the ability to have a different form of rules that are applied to them. There are three questions in this debate. Firstly, why is the comparative on their side of the house still going to be another awful repressive religion? Secondly, if you have fixed rules, are you necessarily going to be coercive to these individuals? And then thirdly, even if we accept their principled grounds, why is it worth it to help these people escape some of the worst cultural practices that are entrenched into their communities? So let's look at the comparative and why the awful religions that tend to be dominant in these societies are unchallenged by their side of the house. Because on the first side, we told you that there is a group of people who live within these patriarchal societies who are deeply wronged by the fact that they're patriarchal and conservative. And secondly, that these people are primed to religious thought and to faith in God that doesn't disappear when they're mistreated, as they wanted to assert in their third and leaders reply. These are people who believe in God and, importantly, want a God that gives them the true guidance to live what they feel is a morally just life. But the second thing to note, though, is that the person in the literal motion slide is confident that they will be successful in gathering followers. We, of course, do not have access to the information that allows them to be confident, but we assume they are rational, we assume they are not one of the delusional people that they wanted to say on their side of the house, and we can create a successful following. Though, even if we aren't 100% likely to be successful, we still think you should take the chance, because the language and norms of communicating through religion are particularly effective, and they haven't adequately outlined harms. Because let's look at the harms that they did bring. And the first was their glowing alternative, which evolved late in their case, of being a social campaigner. A couple things to note. not particularly mutually exclusive. There are going to be other social campaigners out there. You as an individual is just not going to have a particularly large effect. And equally, you can't just have it both ways of having a society that's deeply conservative and will never go into this religion and will somehow be receptive to you standing outside with leaflets, handing them to individuals, right? We don't understand why their alternative ever works. But importantly, you equally aren't likely to hurt the liberal movement or your ability to cooperate or your ability to have progressive thoughts within society, because your small cult will likely just be ignored by the actions in society that are pushing for those types of things unless it is successful. And if it is successful, this is important, the small group of people who you've convinced to join your society are now safe from some of the worst social harms that are visited on them by the fact they have faith in a religion. That's all of the coercion that they wanted to speak about, where these people can't put their faith in God in a non-horrific institution and end up being impressed even more. Because remember, these individuals aren't just the victims of society. They get turned into the perpetrators themselves when they believe their only way to salvation is to inflict FGM on their children rather than feeling like they have a consistent way to escape from those types of tradition. It's very clear at the end of this debate that having fixed rules doesn't make you coercive. Any form of moral argument is going to require people to change their behavior, and the alternative with secularism and with other religions is going to be equally coercive to these people. And if it is coercive, it is worth it. Because you can have both specific rules and general purposes, like treat women well and don't commit FGM, but even if we have a small religion, we protect people from being co-opted by these awful larger ones.
Okay, thanks for the speech, thanks for the debate.
Thank you very much.
Be outside. Yeah.